Usually, when we think about experiencing the world, there's this expectation of, a direct recording.
Right, like a live feed.
Exactly, like a live broadcast. You just open your eyes, the camera rolls, and the screen in your mind shows exactly what's out there in the physical universe.
Yeah, it feels purely objective, which is honestly a very comforting illusion. We naturally want to trust our sensory inputs.
We do. We assume the reality we navigate every single day is just this perfect, unfiltered reflection of our environment. But I want you, the listener, to just settle into a comfortable chair, maybe grab a cup of tea, because today we're going to completely dismantle that idea.
We really are. It's a bit unsettling at first, but ultimately fascinating.
It is, because when you actually look into cognitive psychology and neuroscience, that whole live broadcast theory just falls apart instantly. You realize your experience is much closer to a heavily edited movie.
A post-production reality, yeah.
Yeah, a post-production reality, exactly. And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. We're taking a deep dive into the illusions of the mind, the incredibly complex, unseen mechanisms our brains use to act as, like master editors and storytellers.
And we'll explore how this editing process makes our chaotic lives feel, perfectly smooth and coherent. No prior psychology knowledge needed.
Yeah.
We're going to keep it completely jargon-free.
Absolutely. Before we get into the actual anatomy of these illusions, though, I do want to briefly mention our overarching show, Decoding the Dark. If you enjoy these really deep, relaxing explorations into the unknown, please take a second to like and subscribe.
It really helps.
It does. It directly supports these deep dives and helps us keep decoding this fascinating world. So let's just jump right in. Let's begin at the literal front door of our perception, which is our eyes.
Right. Even at a purely anatomical level, the human eye is it's not a flawless camera. It has a structural constraint that forces the brain to start editing reality before the signal even reaches your conscious awareness.
Wait, you're talking about the blind spot, right?
Sure.
We all have an actual physical void in our visual field.
Yes, in each eye, actually.
Yeah.
And to understand why, you have to look at the architecture of the retina.
Okay, so that's the layer at the back of the eye.
Exactly. It's this incredibly thin layer of tissue at the back of the inner eye. And it's packed with photoreceptor cells. You have rods for low light and peripheral vision, and then cones for color and really fine detail.
Right.
So when light hits these cells, they trigger electrical signals. But the signals don't just, magically teleport to the brain. They have to travel along nerve fibers.
And all those individual fibers have to bundle together somewhere, right? To actually exit the eyeball and head to the visual cortex.
Precisely. They converge at a structure called the optic disc, and that forms the optic nerve. But here's the catch: at the exact location of the optic disc, because all the space is taken up by these outgoing nerve fibers and blood vessels, there's absolutely no room for photoreceptors.
So 0 rods, 0 cones.
0. Because there are no light-sensitive cells there, that specific patch of the retina is entirely blind. It literally cannot register a single photon of light.
Which is an evolutionary quirk that always fascinates me, because we have vertebrate eyes, which are, essentially wired backward.
Yeah, it's a very strange design.
The nerve fibers sit on top of the photoreceptors, which blocks some light, and then they have to plunge back through the retina to get to the brain. That's what creates the hole. But cephalopods, like octopuses, their nerve fibers are routed behind the photoreceptor, so they don't have a blind spot at all.
Right, octopuses have a much more logical wiring system. It's just a classic example of evolution working with what it has, rather than engineering a perfect system from scratch.
But here is the really wild thing. When you look out at a room or look at the sky, you don't see 2 hovering black holes in your vision.
No, you don't.
The visual field feels entirely seamless. So if the optic disc is sending 0 data to the brain about that specific area, how is it that we aren't just constantly swatting at invisible black dots?
Well, your primary visual cortex, which is located at the back of your brain, it handles this missing data through a process called spatial interpolation.
Okay, spatial interpolation. What does that actually mean for the viewer?
First, there's just a simple mechanical fix. Your 2 eyes are positioned slightly apart, so the blind spot in your left eye corresponds to a functional area of the retina in your right eye, and vice versa.
Oh, so they cover for each other.
Exactly. With both eyes open, the brain superimposes the 2 visual fields.
But wait, even if you close one eye right now, if you're listening, try it, close one eye, the black hole doesn't suddenly appear. The world still looks whole.
Because your brain seamlessly fills in the missing information, it extrapolates. The visual cortex analyzes the surrounding context. the pattern of a brick wall you're looking at, or the color of the sky, or the texture of a carpet, and it actively paints that pattern over the gap.
It's like a city road crew that is just so fast, they pave over a pothole a fraction of a millisecond before your tire rolls over it. You never feel the bump.
That's a great analogy.
You just assume the road was always flawless, but in reality, your brain furiously manufactured that piece of the road just in time for you to perceive it.
Yeah, because the visual cortex prioritizes a continuous, uninterrupted experience over absolute factual accuracy.
Mm.
The brain's fundamental goal isn't to present a perfectly accurate map of the world. Its goal is to help you survive.
Right.
And a hovering black void in your vision would be incredibly distracting and, metabolically speaking, very costly to process as an anomaly every single second. So it simply edits it out.
And this physical blind spot is just the hardware limitation. The software limitations, the cognitive blind spots, are where things get truly wild. I'm thinking specifically about change blindness.
Oh, yeah.
The classic example here is that Harvard door experiment conducted by Daniel Simons and Daniel Levin.
It's a foundational study in visual cognition. Absolutely brilliant.
It really is. So for the listener, imagine you are walking across college campus. A researcher walks up to you holding a map and asks for directions. You stop, you look at the map, you start pointing out buildings.
Totally normal interaction.
Right. But suddenly, two construction workers rudely carry a large, solid wooden door right between you and the researcher. Your line of sight to the researcher is blocked for, maybe 1 or 1.5 seconds?
Yeah, a very brief, completely mundane visual interruption.
But in that 1 second, behind the moving door, the original researcher ducks away, and a completely different person stands up and takes their place. They're wearing different clothes, they have a different height, a completely different voice. The door passes, and you are now giving directions to a total stranger.
And the results are just staggering.
Half the people in the experiment never noticed they were talking to a new person.
Watching the raw footage of those experiments is remarkable. You see participants literally continuing their sentence as if nothing happened. This is change blindness. It's the failure to notice significant changes in a visual scene when those changes coincide with a brief visual disruption.
I'm like the passing door.
Exactly. Or a camera cut in a movie, or even a saccade, which is the natural, rapid darting movement of your own eyes.
Oh, that completely explains continuity errors in movies. Like when a character is holding a coffee cup in their left hand, the camera cuts to the other actor, cuts back, and the cup is magically in the right hand. We almost never notice it on the first watch.
We don't. And film editors rely entirely on this cognitive limitation. If the narrative flow, the emotion, and the audio remain consistent, the visual cortex just doesn't bother auditing the peripheral details.
It's just lazy.
Not lazy, efficient. Researchers study the limits of this using the flicker paradigm. They take a high-resolution photograph of a city street, then they alter one massive detail, like they digitally erase an entire building from the background.
An entire building.
An entire building. They flash the first image for a fraction of a second, flash a blank gray screen for a fraction of a second, and then flash the altered image. Back and forth, looping continuously.
So it's basically a highly controlled game of spot the difference, but that blank screen acts as the passing door. It interrupts the visual feed. How long does it actually take someone to notice a whole building is missing?
Studies from perception labs show observers can stare at that flickering image for up to 30 or 40 seconds before they spot the change.
Wow.
But what is truly revealing is that before the test, if you ask people how long it will take them to spot a massive change like a disappearing building, they estimate it'll take them under a second.
Wait, I totally relate to that overconfidence. Even knowing this research, if you tell me someone is going to swap places right in front of me, my immediate instinct is, I would definitely notice that.
Most people think that.
Why is the gap between our perceived awareness and our actual awareness so massive?
Psychologists refer to that secondary phenomenon as change blindness.
Change blindness, okay.
Right, we are blind to our own visual deficits. This stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of how visual attention works in the brain. Most of us intuitively model our attention like a theater spotlight. We assume our conscious awareness casts this wide, bright beam that illuminates the entire stage of our environment, processing all the props, actors, and backdrop simultaneously in high definition.
Right, so we think we're taking in the whole picture, all the time.
But cognitive neuroscientists, examining the attention networks in the brain, suggest a much more accurate metaphor is a narrow beam of a flashlight in a pitch-black forest.
A flashlight?
Your sovea, which is the tiny central pit in your retina responsible for sharp vision, only covers about 2 degrees of your visual field. That is roughly the width of your thumb held at arm's length. Everything outside that 2-degree window is actually quite blurry and completely devoid of rich detail.
Which means your brain is constantly moving that tiny flashlight around, sampling little bits of the environment, and then stitching those tiny high-res samples together to create the illusion of a full, high-definition panoramic view.
Exactly. And the brain only moves that flashlight to areas it deems important. In the door experiment, your flashlight is pointed at the map because the task is giving directions. You have categorized the person holding the map simply as, a stranger asking for directions.
Okay, I see.
When the door passes, the person swapping out is technically outside the beam of your active attention. The brain asks itself, is the stranger asking for directions still there? The answer is yes. It doesn't bother spending metabolic energy to re-verify the specific facial features of the stranger because faces don't spontaneously morph in the natural world.
It really just comes down to energy conservation. The brain consumes about 20% of our body's resting metabolic energy, despite being only like 2% of our body weight. It just can't afford to constantly re-render the entire visual world every millisecond.
It trades exhaustive accuracy for functional efficiency. The brain utilizes an internal model of the world based on probability. This goes back to the 19th century physicist Hermann von Helmholtz, who proposed the idea of unconscious inference. Your perception is not a passive receipt of signals, it is an active, unconscious process of predicting the world.
And if the sensory input roughly matches the prediction, the brain just goes with the prediction.
First,
It's honestly a bit unsettling to realize how much of what we see is just a statistical guess generated by our own biology. But if the brain can pave over visual potholes to keep the illusion smooth, what happens when two different senses directly contradict each other? Because that brings us to auditory illusions, where the brain's role as a post-production editor becomes undeniably clear.
yes. The interaction between different sensory modalities, like how vision affects hearing or how touch affects vision, is called multisensory integration. The brain rarely processes one sense in total isolation.
Which perfectly sets up the McGurk effect. For you listening, this is an illusion you can easily find on video, and it is entirely mind-bending.
It's one of my favorites.
So you watch a close-up video of a person speaking. The audio track playing is the sound bah, a bilabial consonant requiring the lips to close, bah, but the video has been dubbed. The person's lips on screen are clearly mouthing a completely different sound, ga, a velar consonant formed at the back of the throat where the lips stay open. So your ears are receiving the acoustic signature for ba, but your eyes are seeing the visual signature for ga.
And what your brain actually perceives is a third entirely different sound. Bah.
Oh, you hear da, a sound that exists nowhere in the audio recording and nowhere on the video. It feels like absolute magic. How does the brain invent a completely new syllable just because the eyes and ears are arguing?
It happens in an area of the brain called the superior temporal sulcus, which is a major hub for integrating audio and visual information, particularly for speech. When the brain receives conflicting data, ears say ba, eyes say ga, it experiences an error. The visual input and the auditory input don't match up to any known natural event.
Right.
The brain has to reconcile this mismatch before passing the final perception up to your conscious awareness.
So the brain's internal editor steps in and tries to find a compromise.
Exactly. And in human beings, vision is generally the dominant sense. We dedicate a massive amount of our cortex to visual processing. So when hearing and vision conflict, vision usually pulls the auditory perception toward itself. The visual cue of the mouth remaining open strongly vetoes the auditory ba.
Okay.
So the brain calculates the most probable middle ground between the acoustic data of ba and the visual data of ga, and determines that da is the most logical acoustic fit that matches the visual motion.
What I find so incredible about the McGurk effect is its permanence. You can know the audio is ba. You can literally be the researcher who edited the video. But the second you open your eyes and look at the screen, you hear da. You cannot force your brain to hear the true audio as long as your eyes are open.
Because multisensory integration is a pre-attentive process. It happens deep in the neural circuitry, milliseconds before the synthesized result is delivered to your conscious mind. Your higher order logic, the part of you that knows it's a trick, it operates too slowly and too far downstream to intercept or override the basic sensory fusion.
Wow. But the brain's auditory processing doesn't just synthesize conflicting data. It can be hijacked to create feelings of movement or spatial location that don't even exist. Let's look at the Shepard tone.
The Shepard tone. Named after cognitive scientist Roger Shepard, It's basically the auditory equivalent of an optical illusion. It's specifically like an Embassy Escher staircase that seems to ascend infinitely but never actually goes anywhere.
I instantly think of Christopher Nolan movies.
Ah.
It was heavily used in the score for Dunkirk to create this unbearable, suffocating feeling of mounting tension. It sounds like a siren or a musical chord that is endlessly rising in pitch. It goes higher and higher minute after minute, but if you actually measure it, the overall pitch of the sound isn't getting any higher. It's a sonic barber pole.
It is.
How do you create an infinite loop of rising tension?
It requires a very specific acoustic synthesis. You superimpose multiple sine waves, which are pure tones, that are separated by octaves. For example, you might have a bass tone, a middle tone, one octave up, and a high tone, another octave up, all playing simultaneously.
So it's a complex chord.
Yes. Now you gradually raise the pitch of all three tones together. But here is the trick. As the highest tone rises, you slowly fade its volume out to 0. Simultaneously, you introduce a new tone at the very bottom octave, starting at 0 volume and slowly fading it in as it rises.
Oh, so the brain naturally anchors onto the tones that are clear and steadily rising in pitch, and completely fails to notice the new low frequencies being sneaked in at the bottom of the audio mix.
Precisely. Your auditory cortex detects the upward motion of the frequencies and extrapolates that the sound is continuously ascending. It loses track of the absolute pitch because the relative pitch is always moving up. It is hacking the brain's pattern recognition system, resulting in an illusion of infinite escalation.
Which triggers a huge emotional response. It makes you feel anxious, like something is about to snap.
Very anxious.
But on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, we have auditory illusions designed specifically to induce deep relaxation. Let's explore binaural beats.
Binaural beats are fascinating. They rely on the neurological mechanism of sound localization. In nature, your brain figures out where a sound is coming from by comparing the microsecond differences in when a sound wave hits your left ear versus your right ear and the slight differences in volume. This is processed in the brainstem, in a region called the superior olivary complex.
So if a twig snaps on my left, the sound hits my left ear a fraction of a millisecond before my right ear, and the brainstem basically does the geometry to tell me the location.
Exactly. Binaural beats exploit this system using stereo headphones. If you play a sustained pure tone of 300 Hz in the left ear and a pure tone of 310 Hz in the right ear, you present the brain with an acoustic impossibility.
Because that doesn't happen in nature.
Right. In the natural world, a single continuous sound source does not deliver two permanently differing frequencies to the ears.
The brainstem tries to locate the sound, but the math just doesn't work.
Right. The superior olivary complex attempts to reconcile this phase difference. In its effort to integrate the two mismatched signals, the brain actually generates an internal perception of a third frequency, a phantom beat that pulses at exactly the mathematical difference between the two tones, in this case, 10 Hz.
The 310 minus 300. You perceive a 10 Hz pulse, even though there is no 10 Hz sound wave actually entering your ear canal.
Right, and 10 Hz falls squarely within the range of alpha brainwaves. Through a process called frequency following response, or brainwave entrainment, the thalamocortical oscillations in your brain can begin to sync with this phantom 10 Hz beat.
And what does that do?
Well, alpha waves are heavily associated with states of deep relaxation, light meditation, and reduced anxiety.
So it's literally a neuroacoustic hack. You feed the brain a mathematical anomaly, and the byproduct is a phantom frequency that physically lulls your nervous system into a relaxed state. It's fascinating how vulnerable our perception is to these synthetic inputs.
And that vulnerability extends to the technology we interact with every single day. There is a deeply prevalent modern illusion governed by the somatosensory system, which is the part of the brain that processes touch.
Phantom vibration syndrome.
Or hypohypochondria, as it is sometimes classified in behavioral studies.
I experience this constantly, and I know almost everyone listening has too. You're walking down the street or sitting at a desk, and you feel that highly specific, distinct buzzing of your smartphone in your pocket. You reach in, pull the phone out, and the screen is completely black.
Nothing there.
No text, no notification, no alarm. Your leg undeniably felt a vibration that did not exist. There was a great anecdote in the research about a woman named Valerie Kussler who works on a large cattle ranch. She was constantly pulling her phone out because she felt it vibrating, only to eventually realize her brain was confusing the low-frequency, muffled mooing of distant cows with the haptic feedback motor of her phone.
It sounds absurd, but it perfectly illustrates the concept of signal detection theory within neuroscience. Your brain is constantly bombarded with noisy sensory data, the friction of your clothing, the twitch of a muscle, the low rumble of a passing truck. The brain has to decide which of those signals are meaningful and which are just background noise.
So how does it decide that a phantom vibration is a text message?
Because of neuroplasticity and dopaminergic reward anticipation, we have heavily trained our brains to associate the vibration of a phone with a social reward, a message from a friend, an email, a dopamine hit. Because the reward is highly desired, the brain unconsciously lowers its threshold for detecting that specific tactile stimulus. It becomes hypervigilant.
It wants the text message so badly that it creates false positives.
Yes, in signal detection theory, when you lower the threshold for detecting a signal to ensure you don't miss any hits, you inevitably increase the number of false alarms. Your somatosensory cortex takes an ambiguous input, say a slight shift of your jeans against your thigh, and the brain's predictive engine forcefully interprets it as the highly anticipated phone vibration. Technology hasn't just changed our habits, it has literally recalibrated the sensory thresholds in our nervous system.
Wow, we are constantly predicting our reality based on what we desire or expect. And if you think about it, we've just seen how the brain heavily edits what we see, what we hear, and what we physically feel. But surely there is a line. Our sensory inputs might be malleable, but our internal preferences, our logic, our choices, those belong strictly to us, right? We are the authors of our own decisions.
That is the core assumption of human autonomy. But when we look at cognitive illusions, we find that the brain's editorial control extends deeply into our higher order reasoning and our sense of self.
This brings us to choice blindness, a phenomenon that truly shakes the foundation of how we view our own decision-making. The seminal work here was done by cognitive scientists Peter Johansson and Lars Hall.
Their experiments are brilliantly subversive because they target the introspection illusion, which is our unwavering belief that we have direct, accurate insight into the origins of our own mental states and choices.
Let me break down their famous face swap experiment because the methodology is so clever. Imagine you're sitting across from a researcher. They hold up two photographs of different people and ask a simple question. Which of these two faces do you find more attractive? You look at them, and you point to the face on the right.
A standard, low-stakes preference task.
Exactly. The researcher says great and slides your chosen photograph face down across the table to you. They ask you to pick it up, look at it, and explain why you chose that person. But here is the trick. The researcher is trained in sleight of hand magic. As they slide the photo across the table, they secretly swap it for the photo you just rejected.
So you pick up the picture of the person you explicitly decided was less attractive just 3 seconds prior.
Right. And the researcher looks at you and says, so why did you choose this face? Now, if our conscious minds are fully tracking our decisions, 100% of people should immediately say, wait, I didn't pick this one. This is the other photo.
But the data reveals a massive blind spot. Only about 13% of participants noticed the swap immediately. The vast majority of people looked down at a face they had just rejected, accepted it as their own choice, and seamlessly began explaining their reasoning.
And the reasons they gave were incredibly detailed. They would say, well, I really like her smile, or I've always preferred blondes, even if the person they originally pointed to was a brunette. They were confidently generating logic to support a choice they literally did not make. How is that neurologically possible? Are we just making up reasons for everything we do?
The mechanism at play here is called post hoc rationalization. Post hoc meaning after the fact. In this scenario, the participant's conscious mind is suddenly presented with an established outcome. You are holding this photo, therefore you must have chosen it.
The brain works backward from the outcome.
Exactly, because noticing the trick requires a high degree of cognitive vigilance that we usually don't deploy in casual situations. The brain accepts the false premise. Once the premise is accepted, the brain's narrative engine, its internal PR agent, essentially kicks in. It cannot tolerate the cognitive dissonance of holding a photo you supposedly chose, but having no reason for choosing it. So it instantly fabricates a plausible, logical story to justify the outcome.
And what's wild is that they don't feel like they are lying. The introspection illusion means they genuinely believe the fake reason they just invented. And Johansson and Hall proved this wasn't just about visual ambiguity. They did it with taste, too.
The magic at the marketplace study.
Right. They set up a tasting booth at a grocery store. You walk up and they give you a small spoonful of blackcurrant jam and a small spoonful of grapefruit jam. Two wildly different flavor profiles. You taste both and you say, I strongly prefer the grapefruit jam.
Okay.
The researcher says, excellent, take one more bite of the grapefruit and tell me what you like about the flavor. But the jam jar is rigged. It has a hidden compartment. So the second spoonful they give you is actually the blackcurrant jam you just rejected.
And despite the fact that blackcurrant and grapefruit activate entirely different gustatory receptors on the tongue, fewer than a third of the participants noticed the switch.
They would stand there eating the blackcurrant jam and eloquently explain, "I just love the tangy, citrusy bitterness of this grapefruit." They override their own taste buds to maintain the narrative that they are consistent decision makers.
It demonstrates that our conscious mind is often not the executive making the choice. Rather, it is the press secretary standing at the podium, inventing a coherent justification for a decision that was either made unconsciously or, in these experiments, forced upon them externally.
We are meaning-making machines. We need our world to make sense. Another incredible example of the brain acting as a storyteller to create meaning is the frequency illusion, widely known as the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon.
This is an illusion of perception that almost everyone encounters regularly.
Yes. For you listening, think about a time you learned a completely new, obscure word. Or perhaps you decided you wanted to buy a very specific car, like a bright blue Honda Civic. Before that day, you never thought about a blue Honda Civic, but the day after you make that decision, suddenly they are everywhere. You see 3 on the highway, 1 parked outside your house, 1 in a television commercial. It feels as though the universe has suddenly populated your reality with this specific object.
It often feels like synchronicity or a glitch in the matrix, but it is entirely the result of 2 well-documented cognitive biases working in tandem: selective attention and confirmation bias.
Let's break down the mechanics. How does selective attention work here?
Selective attention is governed by a network in the brainstem called the reticular activating system, or the RAS. The RAS acts as a gatekeeper for information. At any given second, your senses are receiving millions of bits of data. If your conscious mind had to process all of it, you would collapse from sensory overload. So the RAS filters out anything it deems irrelevant, like the hum of the refrigerator or the hundreds of random cars you pass on a commute.
It's the flashlight in the dark forest again. The RAS decides where to point the beam.
Precisely. When you learn a new word or decide you want a blue Honda Civic, you've essentially given the RAS a new set of instructions. You have tagged that specific piece of information as important. Unconsciously, your brain begins actively scanning the environment for it. The blue cars were always on the highway. Your visual cortex was capturing them, but your RAS was throwing the data away before it reached your conscious awareness. Now the gatekeeper lets it through.
So suddenly you are hyper-aware of every single occurrence. But how does confirmation bias seal the illusion?
Confirmation bias relies on the availability heuristic, a mental shortcut where we heavily weight information that is easily recalled. Every time you see that blue car, your brain registers a hit. It says, aha, there is another one. This is highly unusual. It logs that memory vividly, but what it completely fails to log are the thousands of misses. The red Fords, the silver Toyotas, the black sedans that you also drove past.
You count the hits and ignore the misses.
Exactly. The ratio of blue cars to other cars hasn't changed at all. But because your brain is only logging the hits, your perception of frequency becomes wildly skewed. Your internal storyteller weaves a narrative that the object is appearing more often, creating a compelling but entirely fabricated reality.
It's just a beautiful reminder that our attention literally shapes the world we live in. We don't passively observe reality, we actively curate it. I want to pause on that thought for a moment. As you digest how much of your daily experience is curated by these unseen cognitive biases, I want to gently remind you about decoding the dark. If you're finding these revelations about your own mind valuable, please like and subscribe to the show. It allows us to continue diving deep into the research and bringing these complex, fascinating concepts directly to you.
The mechanics of the brain truly are endless in their complexity.
They really are. And this brings us to a crucial physiological question. We keep talking about this narrative engine, this internal PR agent that invents reasons for our choices, edits our memories, and smooths over cognitive dissonance. Where in the biological tissue of the brain does this storyteller actually live?
To locate it, we have to examine some of the most radical, illuminating medical research of the 20th century. The split brain experiments.
The pioneering work of Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga in the 1960s. For context, these experiments were made possible by a very specific, extreme surgical procedure used to treat patients suffering from debilitating, life-threatening epilepsy.
When epileptic seizures are unmanageable with medication, the electrical storm in the brain often starts in one hemisphere and rapidly cascades across to the other hemisphere, causing massive grand mal seizures. To prevent this cascade, neurosurgeons would perform a corpus callosotomy.
They would sever the corpus callosum.
Yes. The corpus callosum is a massive, thick tract of roughly 200 million nerve fibers that bridges the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. It is the high-speed data cable that allows the two halves of the brain to constantly communicate and share sensory information.
So the surgeons literally cut the brain in half. They disconnect the left side from the right side.
It cured the severe epilepsy because the electrical storm could no longer cross the bridge, but it resulted in split-brain patients. To the casual observer, these patients seemed completely normal. But Gazzaniga realized that because the two hemispheres could no longer communicate, he could design experiments to talk to each hemisphere completely independently.
To understand how he did this, we have to quickly outline how the brain is wired to the body. It is heavily contralateral, meaning the left hemisphere of your brain controls the motor functions of the right side of your body and receives the sensory input from your right visual field. The right hemisphere controls the left side of your body and receives input from the left visual field.
And crucially, there is lateralization of cognitive function. For the vast majority of people, the neural architecture required for language Broca's area for speech production and Wernicke's area for language comprehension is heavily localized in the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is highly capable of spatial reasoning, facial recognition, and emotion, but it is essentially mute. It cannot speak.
This setup allowed Gazzaniga to perform the legendary chicken claw and snow experiment.
It is the definitive demonstration of the brain's storytelling mimetism. Gazzaniga had a split-brain patient sit in front of the screen with a divider down the middle, so each eye could only see one half of the screen.
Right, isolating the visual fields.
He flashed an image of a snowy winter scene to the left visual field, which travels exclusively to the silent right hemisphere. Simultaneously, he flashed an image of a chicken claw to the right visual field, which travels exclusively to the speaking left hemisphere.
So, isolated inside one skull, the left brain sees a chicken claw, and the right brain sees snow. They cannot share this information.
Then, Gazzaniga placed an array of picture cards on the table in front of the patient and asked them to point to the images that related to what they just saw on the screen. The right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere, reaches out and points to a picture of a chicken. This is perfectly logical. The left brain saw a chicken claw. It points to a chicken.
Makes total sense.
But simultaneously, the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, reaches out and points to a picture of a snow shovel. This is also perfectly logical because the right brain saw a snow scene. Both isolated hemispheres are functioning rationally based on the data they received.
But then Gazzaniga asks the million-dollar question.
He asks the patient out loud, "Why did you point to those items?" Remember, because language is localized on the left, it is the left hemisphere that must generate the verbal answer.
But the left hemisphere has a massive problem. It knows why its right hand pointed to the chicken, but it has absolutely zero idea why the left hand just pointed to a snow shovel because it never saw the snow scene. The bridge is cut.
If the brain operated like a purely objective computer, the left hemisphere would simply say, "I pointed to the chicken because I saw a claw. But I have no idea why my left hand just pointed to a shovel. It moved on its own."
But it never says that.
Never. Without missing a beat, the patient's left hemisphere looks at the shovel, looks at the chicken, and instantly fabricates a logical link. The patient replies, "Oh, that's simple. The chicken claw goes with the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed."
That is staggering. The left brain observes an action it didn't initiate, experiences total ignorance as to the cause, and in a fraction of a second, hallucinates a completely coherent, rational narrative to explain it, and the patient believes it entirely.
Gazzaniga coined a specific term for this neural module, the left brain interpreter. It is a specialized system in the left hemisphere whose absolute biological imperative is to seek causal explanations. It takes all the disparate inputs, our behaviors, our shifting autonomic states, the environment, and sews them together into a unified, continuous story.
And it absolutely refuses to tolerate a void. If it doesn't have the facts, it will invent them to avoid cognitive dissonance. There was another experiment with a split-brain patient that highlighted this beautifully with emotion.
Yes, the emotional transfer experiments. Gazzaniga flashed a highly disturbing, frightening video exclusively to a patient's right hemisphere. The right hemisphere cannot speak, but it processes the emotion, and it triggers a systemic autonomic response. The patient's heart rate spikes, their palms sweat, they feel intense anxiety.
But the left hemisphere, the part that speaks, has no visual data. It just suddenly feels the body panicking.
Exactly. The left brain interpreter suddenly detects a massive physiological shift anxiety, but lacks the environmental trigger. It cannot stand this unexplained dissonance. So when asked why she was suddenly upset, the patient's left hemisphere immediately looked around the room, latched onto the closest variable, and blamed the researcher. She said, "I don't know, Dr. Gaznig, there's just something about you that is really creeping me out right now."
It's incredible. The interpreter literally hallucinates a social conflict to explain a biological spike in cortisol. Most of the time, for those of us with intact corpus callosums, this interpreter is our greatest asset. It constantly smooths over the rough edges of reality, keeping us sane, preventing us from being paralyzed by the millions of tiny inconsistencies in our daily lives. But what happens when the brain sustains severe physical damage? When the hardware breaks down, how does the storyteller react?
When the brain's memory architecture or sensory pathways are damaged, the left brain interpreter doesn't just stop working. It often goes into pathological overdrive. This brings us into clinical neurology and a phenomenon known as confabulation.
Confabulation is often described as honest lying. Can you break down the neurology of what is actually happening there?
Confabulation is most frequently observed in patients with severe damage to the frontal lobes, or the diencephalon, which houses structures critical for memory, like the mammillary bodies. A classic example is Korsakoff syndrome, a profound memory disorder often caused by severe thiamine deficiency linked to chronic alcohol abuse. The patient develops profound anterograde amnesia. They completely lose the ability to form new memories.
So their memory is full of massive gaping holes. If you ask them what they did yesterday, they legitimately have no data to draw from.
But instead of expressing confusion or stating, "I don't remember," the patient will confidently deliver a highly detailed, completely fabricated story. Their left brain interpreter encounters the memory void, and its mandate to create order forces it to act. It seamlessly sews together fragments of old memories, things they recently saw on television, or logical deductions based on their immediate environment, and presents it to consciousness as a factual memory.
It's exactly like the predictive text algorithm on a smartphone. The phone has no idea what you actually intend to say next. It just analyzes the previous sequence of words, calculates the highest statistical probability for the next logical word, and autofills it to keep the sentence moving.
That is an incredibly accurate analogy. Confabulation is the brain's predictive algorithm running unchecked without grounding in reality. If you ask a hospitalized patient with Korsakoff syndrome what they did that morning, their brain observes their current environment, the hospital bed, the nurses, the sterile walls. It infers a context. The patient might look you in the eye and confidently explain that they are a visiting surgeon who just completed a complex triple bypass operation.
And they aren't trying to deceive you, they aren't conning you.
No. To the patient, the confabulation feels indistinguishable from a genuine episodic memory. The internal narrative is so strong that the distinction between fact and generated fiction is completely obliterated.
That is heartbreaking, but it highlights just how powerful the need for a coherent narrative is. But there is an even more extreme manifestation of this reality editing software in the medical world: anosognosia.
Anosognosia is a profound neuropsychiatric condition. The term comes from Greek, meaning without knowledge of disease. It occurs when a patient suffers a massive physical deficit-like complete paralysis of the left side of their body following a right hemisphere stroke, but they possess an absolute structural inability to recognize that the deficit exists.
Wait, they are paralyzed on one side, but they genuinely believe they have full motor control.
Yes. If a neurologist asks an anasognosic patient to raise their paralyzed left arm, the arm naturally remains motionless on the bed. When the neurologist gently points out that the arm did not move, the patient's left brain interpreter instantly generates a rationalization. They might say, "Oh, my shoulder is just a little sore today, I don't feel like lifting it," or "I did lift it, you just weren't looking." In extreme cases, they might point to their paralyzed arm and claim it belongs to the doctor or to a relative sitting in the room.
Their brain is willing to sever ownership of their own limb rather than accept the reality of the paralysis. And the sources point to a specific, incredibly rare variant of this called Anton syndrome, which deals with vision.
Anton syndrome is perhaps the most striking example of the brain's capacity for illusion. It is the absolute denial of blindness. It typically arises from bilateral damage to the occipital lobes, the primary visual processing centers at the very back of the brain. The patient's eyes might be perfectly healthy, receiving light, but the cortex cannot process the signals. The patient is functionally entirely blind.
But they don't know it.
They fervently deny it. Because their language centers and their left brain interpreter are still intact, the brain refuses to accept the darkness. Unmoored from actual visual input, the brain simply begins hallucinating a visual reality. If you ask a patient with Anton syndrome to describe the room they are in, they will invent vivid details. They will describe the pattern on the doctor's tie, the color of the walls, the view out the window.
But if they stand up and try to walk, they are going to crash into things. How do they explain that to themselves?
When they inevitably walk into a wall or trip over a chair, their interpreter effortlessly rationalizes the failure. They will blame the lighting, saying the room is too dim. They will complain that the chair was moved unexpectedly or that they are just feeling clumsy today.
Neurologist V.S. Ramachandran has written extensively about this. He suggests that these extreme confabulations aren't just glitches, they are profound psychological defense mechanisms. The reality editing software kicks in to protect the ego, the self, from reality that is simply too catastrophic to process.
That aligns with the predictive coding framework of the brain, largely pioneered by neuroscientist Carl Friston. Friston's free energy principle posits that the brain's ultimate imperative is to minimize surprise. It constantly generates internal models of the world and updates those models based on sensory feedback. But if a stroke destroys the pathways that deliver the feedback, the pathways that carry the error signal stating the arm is paralyzed or the eyes are blind, the brain cannot update the model. It becomes trapped in its own outdated prediction.
It's the visual blind spot pothole analogy taken to its absolute tragic limit. The brain paves over a massive crater paralysis, blindness, so the conscious mind doesn't have to face the terrifying void beneath.
Precisely. The brain will hallucinate an entire reality to maintain the integrity of its internal narrative.
Which brings us to the final and undoubtedly most profound implication of all this research. We have traced how the brain edits visual blind spots, how it synthesizes conflicting audio, how it hallucinates post hoc reasons for choices we didn't make, and how it can literally fabricate reality to cover up disease. All of this points a massive spotlight at the ultimate illusion.
The science of free will. If the brain is constantly generating the narrative after the fact, to what extent is the conscious you actually in the driver's seat?
Let's delve into the neurobiology of this, because it's one thing for philosophers to debate determinism, but it's another thing entirely to look at the electrical activity of the cortex. This debate was forcefully dragged into the realm of neuroscience in the 1980s by Benjamin Libet.
The Libet experiments are foundational. Libet wanted to measure the precise timeline of a conscious decision. He brought participants into a lab and attached electroencephalogram, or EEG, electrodes to their scalps to monitor the electrical activity in their motor cortex.
He gave them a very simple, spontaneous task, right?
Yes. He asked them to sit quietly and simply flick their wrist whenever they felt the spontaneous urge to do so. There was no external cue. The decision had to come entirely from within. Crucially, they were watching a highly specialized, fast-moving oscilloscope clock. Libet asked them to note the exact millisecond on the clock when they first became consciously aware of the urge, the intention, to move their wrist.
Okay, so he is measuring 3 specific data points. Point A, the exact millisecond the physical wrist actually moves. Point B, the exact millisecond the person reports feeling the conscious desire to move. And point C, the background electrical buildup in the brain leading up to the movement.
Exactly. Now, our intuitive assumption of free will says the timeline should look like this. First, your conscious mind decides to move. Second, your brain prepares the motor signals. Third, your wrist moves.
Cause and effect.
But Libet's EEG readings showed something that shocked the scientific community. A specific, identifiable pattern of electrical activity, known as the readiness potential, began building up in the supplementary motor area of the brain before the participant reported feeling the conscious urge to move.
Wait, stop. You're telling me the physical brain started spooling up the machinery to move the wrist before the person's conscious mind had any idea they were going to move it?
Yes. In Libet's original data, the unconscious readiness potential began about 350 to 400 milliseconds before the conscious awareness of the decision.
Okay, 400 milliseconds is a fraction of a second. You could argue that's just a margin of error in reporting, or the time it takes to read a clock.
Many critics did argue exactly that. But modern neuroscience hasn't just replicated Libet's findings, it has magnified them using vastly superior technology. Enter John Dylan Haynes and his team at the Max Planck Institute. Instead of EEG, which only measures surface electrical activity, Haynes used functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, which maps blood flow and metabolic activity deep within the brain in real time.
And what was Haynes' setup?
Participants lay inside the fMRI scanner, holding a button in their left hand and a button in their right hand. They were told to relax, watch a screen flashing random letters, and whenever they felt like it, spontaneously press either the left or the right button. They just had to remember which letter was on the screen the exact moment they consciously made the choice.
So it's a binary choice now, left or right.
Haynes wasn't looking at the motor cortex, he was looking deeper, into a region called the frontopolar cortex, specifically Brodmann Area 10, which is associated with the highest levels of executive planning and goal-oriented action. By running the fMRI data through advanced pattern recognition algorithms, Haynes' team found they could look at the activity in the frontopolar cortex and predict which button the person was going to press, left or right.
How far in advance?
Up to 10 full seconds before the participant consciously registered making the decision.
10 seconds. If an MRI machine can look at the blood flow in my frontal lobes and mathematically predict what I'm going to do 10 seconds before I actually decide to do it, the concept of a conscious decision is completely retroactive. Am I just a passenger? Is my entire conscious life just a delayed broadcast of a movie my biology already shot and edited?
That is the existential dread that often accompanies reading this research. As Haynes himself summarized it, the data strongly suggests that decisions are prepared by unconscious brain networks long before they enter conscious awareness. The conscious self is the last to know.
This feels like it shatters the whole concept of human agency. How do we reconcile this without falling into total nihilism?
It requires a paradigm shift in how we define you. The discomfort, the feeling of being a passenger, comes from a deeply ingrained dualism. We tend to equate our identity purely with our conscious awareness, that little narrating voice in our head. We think, if my conscious voice didn't initiate the action, then I didn't do it. But your unconscious brain, the intricate, massive neural networks crunching data in the dark, is still completely biologically you.
It's just a part of me that operates beneath the surface of my awareness.
Exactly. Think back to the predictive engine framework. Your brain is a supercomputer processing millions of variables. Your genetics, your lifetime of encoded memories, your current physiological state, the environmental context. When faced with a choice, the vast unconscious networks in your frontal lobes do the heavy lifting. They weigh the probabilities, evaluate the historical data of what has kept you safe or brought you reward in the past, and formulate the optimal decision.
So the unconscious is doing all the complex math because the conscious mind is too slow and has too little bandwidth to handle it.
Yes, consciousness is metabolically expensive and highly constrained. It can only hold a few items in working memory at once. If your conscious mind had to actively process every variable involved in a decision, you would freeze. So the unconscious makes the decision, and then up to 10 seconds later, in the case of the Haynes experiment, it hands the finalized report up to consciousness.
It's like a massive corporation. The thousands of analysts and algorithms working in the lower departments compile the data, make the strategy, and drop the finalized executive summary on the CEO's desk. The CEO, which is my conscious awareness, reads it, signs it, and feels the illusion of having come up with the idea entirely alone. But the whole corporation is still me.
That is the perfect way to look at it. The delay isn't an illusion of reality. It is just the biological processing time required for a massively complex system to finalize an output. Consciousness kicks in later to experience the outcome, to log it into episodic memory, and crucially, to allow the left brain interpreter to weave that choice into your ongoing autobiographical narrative.
My unconscious does the hard work so my conscious mind doesn't get overwhelmed. That is actually deeply comforting. It reframes what feels like a lack of control into a profound appreciation for the brain's ultimate efficiency.
It is the ultimate manifestation of evolutionary elegance.
And that reframing brings us beautifully to the conclusion of our deep dive today. As we look back at the breadth of what we've covered, from the visual cortex painting over the blind spot in our retinas, to the superior temporal sulcus inventing new syllables to resolve audio conflicts, the left brain interpreter hallucinating reasons for choices we didn't make, right down to the 10-second readiness potential in our frontal lobes. The overriding theme is not that our brains are broken.
Not at all. None of these illusions are flaws. They are highly optimized evolutionary heuristics. If your visual system didn't fill in gaps or ignore irrelevant background changes, you would be paralyzed by the visual noise of a constantly morphing world. If your auditory system didn't synthesize conflicting data, communication would be chaotic.
And if our left brain interpreter didn't relentlessly weave a coherent narrative, making sense of our disparate actions and unconscious urges, we would experience reality as a terrifying, fragmented series of random events. These neural edits, these post-production tricks, are the very mechanisms that allow us to navigate a wildly unpredictable universe with a sense of continuity, identity, and peace.
They are the quiet, tireless efforts of your biology striving to keep you safe and sane.
We want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to mull over. Based on the absolute certainty that your brain is constantly running this left brain interpreter, constantly inventing the narrative of your life, making up logical reasons for your actions after the fact, perhaps the conscious self is not the author of the story.
Perhaps the self is the story, a continuous, beautiful fiction generated by the biology of the brain to give the organism a reason to keep moving forward.
The self is the story. That is a stunning concept to carry with you. We want to warmly thank you for joining us on this mind-bending journey. Before we sign off, a final reminder: if you appreciate these deep, rigorous explorations into the science of our reality, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Decoding the Dark. It ensures we can keep exploring these incredible topics together. Today, take a moment to appreciate the brilliant storytelling supercomputer inside your head. The next time you find yourself automatically rationalizing a strange choice or missing a blatant continuity error in a film, just smile. Remember how beautifully, how tirelessly your mind is working behind the scenes to keep your world intact. Stay curious,